Thank you, Dr. Keita, for a wonderfully warm introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. This opportunity to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Africana Studies at Villanova is important in itself. It also resonates with my times in and out of Africana Studies or African American Studies programs, as well as African history programs. And so just thinking about what I would want to say gave me a chance to look back over a career that goes quite a ways back. So I decided history of Africa was what I was most interested in when I was 20, but that was 1961. So, and we'll get a look at a bit of that in a moment. I will say one more personal thing, which is that in the last year I finished up, along with a colleague, an article reviewing the writings in African history that were done on the African continent by scholars there from the 1950s up to the present. And it was a lot of work going through all of that. And it was upsetting in a few ways, but mostly it was really quite inspiring to see the tradition and how the continental tradition fits into the wider tradition in Europe and the Americas. And so that's why I organized the presentation today to alternate between Africa for a certain period and then North America for a certain period. There's a lot more of the diaspora that I'm going to leave out in the course of this, but this is supposed to give you the idea of some of the interconnections in history over this last 60, 70 years. So basic facts, right? Reminder how many people we are talking about. The population of Africa and the African diaspora is 1.5 billion people, more than 1/6 of the world's population. And so when it gets left out of analyses of one sort or another, then you know that the analysis is unrepresentative of people overall. So, to also emphasize that the diaspora population, the population in North and South America, in North Africa, if you want to separate that from the rest of the continent, in Europe, throughout Asia, that's a population of substantial size and considerable importance. Okay. So this is my first period, 1945 to 1970, and a look at the African continent. And I begin with Abdoulaye Ly, over there on the left, who wrote the first book to come out in French that was really substantial African history on the Compagnie du Sénégal, the first French slave trading firm on the coast of Africa. I happened to show up in Dakar at the time of the memorial service for Abdoulaye Ly, who died at 92 in 2013, and who'd written his book in 1958 and some other books after that. So impressed to see hundreds of people showing up from Dakar to speak and to listen and to celebrate this cultural and historical hero. Another person to look at from those earlier days is Alioune Diop, who's also of Senegalese ancestry and the founder of Présence Africaine, the main French language historical and cultural journal which continues through to this day. And then I highlighted the three figures that are the center of this lecture. Léopold Sédar Senghor, Léon-Damas, and Aimé Césaire, whose work actually began in the 1930s when they were young poets, and then they had mostly long lives, in any case, more important figures. And then to turn to the Anglophone side, Ibadan University in Nigeria. It was the first university in Nigeria founded in the 1950s, and they got right to work publishing in Africa, a major history series, and there's a bunch of the volumes from it. And that lasted a good 15 years and then slowed down. And Frantz Fanon, as one of many political figures and philosophers that we could pick out. I'm going too fast to do any more than just look at folks, so we'll switch now over to the North American side and that same time period. So here I pick out John Hope Franklin, whose book, From Slavery to Freedom, the main textbook in African American history, came out first in 1947. John Hope Franklin, interestingly, was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1915. He was 5 years old when the great race riot happened in Tulsa that wiped out all of the structures, not all of the people, but a fair number of the people, of what had been a prosperous African American community, a community which had grown up, as John Hope Franklin's community had grown up, from people who were slaves themselves of the Cherokee and Chickasaw who settled that land. In any case, so Franklin, as we'll see, went on to a distinguished career. So that's the 1940s. and the 1950s. Desegregation in the schools is certainly a big issue in North America, and there are resonances to that in other places. So here's a picture of the plaintiff, Linda Brown. And then a look at 1968. So that was a rough year. We lost Dr. King about this time, in spring of 1968. And then in the summer of 1968, the Olympics in Mexico City. It gave us this famous picture of two American sprinters, Tommy Smith, who set a world record in his 200-yard dash, and John Carlos, making a Black Power, a stance that was widely recognized. And the third person that's there, Peter Norman, was an Australian sprinter who got second place. And he also formally associated himself with the other two, and as part of an Olympics human rights organization that formed itself in the 1968 Mexico Olympics. So those are the rough times. On the other hand, this is a time when Black Studies programs were founded. So at Northeastern University, where I showed up in 1984, but in 1968 is when African American Studies was founded, both as a teaching department and as a counseling and support group for African American students in particular. So I got to watch that group as they went through their 25th anniversary renewal, and some of the old folks came back. Turns out I already knew some of the old folks. It was fascinating. And then I went to University of Pittsburgh, and turns out there too, 1968 was the year when what's now Africana Studies was founded there. And they had their grand reunion in year 40. And so I was there in 2008. To see the things that I had missed in earlier times. So that's the beginning of formal university programs in universities more broadly and generally in the U.S. Let's see. Oh no, it's time for me to go to my go to the movies. Let's see if I can do this. Yes. Because I want to go back to the, cannot find my cursor. There it is. I want to go back to the 60s and what have I got? I'm stuck with this thing. Can't get out of it. I do not want that. There we are. Okay. No, I got the wrong, it switched to the wrong music.
Let's see. Let's see.
Yes, we should not have closed it.
Like back page.
Yeah, back page.
Go back one. Yeah, here we are. Okay. So this is the end of June 1960. Belgian Congo becomes Republic of the Congo. Independence for the workers. Table Ronde was a meeting where they decided to go ahead with independence. They're singing in Lingala. Moïse Chombe. Joseph Kasavubu. Patrice Lumumba. Okay. Now, how do I get out of here? There we go. I have to get a little further out.
So slide your cursor over the top.
Ah, but I can't get out of there.
Okay. Let's see.
Ah, there it is.
Right there. Yeah.
Okay, back up.
Okay.
Well, that song has become so famous. It represents the whole era. Okay, next. So figures from the period 1970 to 1990, a more formalized generation, and on the other hand, a time when both for Africa and for North America, economics times are a little more difficult, so forth. Cheikh Anta Diop, Senegalese, a physical scientist and social scientist as well. He wrote this book on the African origin of civilization, published it in French in 1967, translated into English in 1974. It created a huge resonance amongst people in Black Studies programs in the US. And Joseph Kizerbo from Burkina Faso wrote the first really big, thick history of Africa in French, and it remains a very fine book and never got translated into English. So the rough times then were the Soweto Rebellion, 1976. This is Hector Peterse being carried on his way. He's not quite dead yet, but he'd been shot by the Afrikaner police, and the riots went on for quite some time. That was also the time of the structural adjustment programs, and so in the 1980s, all the countries that are in red there got deeper and deeper in debt, varying levels of debt, supervised by the World Bank. But what it meant was really serious cutbacks in universities, so no more stipends for students, and faculty members were forced to retire at age 55 and things like that. But also in the 1980s, major discovery of using genomic work, using mitochondrial DNA to demonstrate through a really interesting experiment that the ancestry of all humans was tied back to Africa and no place else, and that it could be dated something on the order of 200,000 years ago. So that the effects of that discovery, which has been tested and reconfirmed in various ways, really spread very gradually. I can't date exactly when I found out, but I remember the room that I was standing in. I was in the Office of African American Studies at Northeastern, and Ron Bailey, who was chair of the department, described what he had learned about mitochondrial DNA and the implications of this for the centrality of Africa and Africans in world history. This effect has spread more and more widely, and so here I'm showing its effect in Africa, and then the same thing happened at the same time in North America. I just described for you the North American side of it. Up here at the left, I've got a Black Power sign and a meeting. I'm actually cheating a little bit, and the years at Stokely Carmichael, and this is 1968, not the 1970s. Okay, but as a you know, it's an aftermath of the killing of Dr. King, but it's a broader set of complaints by people that independence in Africa or civil rights in North America were not leading far enough to the changes that people had expected, and so demands for more change became very prominent at that time. I put Gwendolyn Brooks as an example of one of the just many fine arts in literature and music who've shown up in this whole period. And she came to Northeastern and read from her poetry. It was very striking. The National Council for Black Studies, that was the group, the academic group that held together the Black Studies programs in the 70s and 80s and on. The organization still exists now, but there are many more organizations, so it doesn't have the prominence that it had before. And then here's John Hope Franklin again. We come back 40 years later, and he's now president of the American Historical Association, 1978-79. So to go into the next 15-year period, 1990s, the end of the Cold War and so forth, it's the big changes in South Africa, and I chose to emphasize rather than the liberation of Nelson Mandela and so forth, and even the Constitution, which is, if you ever get involved in constitutional studies, the South African Constitution was created by a huge convention of lawyers from all over the world. It's the most interesting constitution on the face of the earth. But here's Nelson Mandela taking the oath of office as president in South Africa in 1994. And then after that, I've listed two Malawian scholars, Thandika Mkandawire, who was the Secretary General of CODESRIA, which is the Council for the Development of Economic and Social Research in Africa, founded in 1963 in Dakar, 73 rather. And it exists as just a broad organization representing all of the social sciences and trying to keep in touch with people all over the continent. In this time in the early and mid-90s, Mkandawire, as he finished up his term, made an argument that maybe the organization should reach out a little more broadly rather than just focusing on keeping the African scholars in touch with one another, to reach out to the European and other scholars. So that led to a 5-year debate as the organizations did indeed spread out further, and spread out so far that it seemed to be nearly destroying the organization. And so they resolved the dispute, I'll just say it in that way. But just to point to a time period when in one sense scholarly work is developing in Africa, and in another sense how to balance their efforts is threatening to cause real complications. Below is Paul-Tyambe-Seleza, also Malawi. These two Malawians don't live in Malawi. Mkandawire lives in Sweden, and Seleza lives in the United States. He wrote a book on economic history of Africa in 1994, which won a Japanese-supported prize as the best book written in Africa that year. So it was an indication of strong and interesting scholarship showing up. Well, he got drawn into university administration, so he now moves from university to university, administrating larger and larger structures. He's very good at it. But both of these two people stay in touch with CODESRIA. Wangari Maathai, any of you know her name? Time has passed. Okay, so she is a Kenyan-born biologist. She actually did her master's degree at University of Pittsburgh, and after she got her Nobel Peace Prize, she came back and gave a talk there in 2006. But her work was in biology and forestry, but her particular campaign was to work among the women of Kenya in a women's movement to plant trees. So it was a reforestation program that became a huge movement, and Greenbelt movement is the name of it, and so that was the basis of her Nobel Prize. She's since passed, but she's a terrific speaker in her day. All right, same time period in North America. So this is the time period, 1994, when the Villanova Africana Studies program comes into place. All right, and so there's one point there, and then I've put Howard University. Partly I have to put Howard University because Magan Keita is here, but partly is to remind us that this story that I've told, it goes back to 1950, is a truncated part of the story, because from Howard, which existed for nearly a century before that, there's been a long-term effort at building scholarship on African history and on African American history. But this time in the 1990s was a time in which the programs that were founded, like the ones that I mentioned at Northeastern and at Pitt, were some of them surviving and some of them collapsing. So I remember from that time quite a number of Black Studies programs being closed down and some new ones forming. And it seems to have balanced out overall. I mean, I would say that from that time in the 1960s, when programs in African history, because that's what I was associated with first, and then in African American history, I was associated with that a little more slowly, that those programs have been renewed. When people retire or leave, basically new people are brought in. Maybe not enough, the departments aren't as big as you might like them to be, but nonetheless, this new enterprise has survived, and this was a crucial time in deciding that. And I've given you the image of Roseburg Pen, who's the first picture of her there is in 1985, as she was in the early stages of her research on Black women in women's suffrage activities. So her book, as it came out in 1998, is Struggle for the Vote. That is to say, African American women and the struggle for the vote, 1850 to 1920. It took her a long time to get this work out. She did her work at Morgan State University. That's, I think, the only job she had. She stayed there forever, built a doctoral program there. But it's 20 years ago that the book came out, and if you listen nowadays, you hear a lot of resonance to the question of women's suffrage in the United States, and to what degree it's a white-only movement, or what degree Black women played an important and sometimes marginalized role in it. But this is the person who did the key scholarship. A lot more has followed it up. She passed last year. She used to come to World History Association meetings. And then Toyin Falola is another interesting example of the connections and the mixes between America and Africa. So Falola left Nigeria in 1991. The conditions of work there were such that he, a really active publisher, could no longer get work done. So he came to Canada first and then to the United States. But he wasn't just moving from one place to another, so he's retained his ties in Nigeria. If you go check the Villanova catalog and see how many books in the Villanova library are by Toyin Falola, and you'll see it's one of the largest lists there, both in works that he's published, but especially in co-edited works. So that's what he's a genius at, is pulling together other scholars in Africa, so he holds conferences in Africa, in North America, where he's working with North American scholars or African-born scholars who are doing their university work here, and just getting an immense amount of work out in the field. It's an extraordinary individual level work. All right, so now we're up to the last 15 years. How am I doing on time? Not too bad. And the timing, so I've got Timbuktu as the first slide there. The timing works out really quite well, because it's right about 2005 that the work seriously began in collecting the many manuscripts that were there. So when I was younger, you just heard rumors about Timbuktu as a place where there was a lot of scholarship, and we didn't know if anything is left. Turns out that the families that lived in the area were holding on to the manuscripts that were often several hundred years old. And finally, an atmosphere was created in which people would deliver the manuscripts, in which there was funding to build a library and museum that was, with adequate climatization, and then a staff to support it. One really interesting thing is a lot of the money for support of this exercise came from South Africa. Then there was this awful point at which after the Libyan regime fell, in which Al-Qaeda or whatever sort of proto-Muslim extremists decided they would seize control of Timbuktu and try to destroy the manuscripts. And some manuscripts were destroyed, but the real story is that amazingly, the overwhelming majority of the manuscripts have been saved, they're back in place, and so this library is it's becoming a substantial tourist center, plus a center of scholarship. Okay, in South Africa, life goes on. Universities are open and formally desegregated, but there's a lot to still struggle over. And so there's just a picture from a recent demonstration. But my other slides here emphasize continuities. First up at the top is CODESRIA, so there's the Council for Development of Economic and Social Research in Africa, and I can see it, you probably can't see it, that the things are in English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic, and they keep all those languages going. I went to one of their meetings and you listen to, they alternate amongst them. And this is Ibrahima Sall, who's who was for several years the executive director. I have a story that maybe we'll get to that later. And just below that is a slide that or an image that's a little too hard for you to see, but it's the most colorful one. It's Vespa Co. It's the annual film festival in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. So this year they're having the 50th annual set of film festivals. And these are films from really now, it began Francophone West Africa, but they're now films from all over the continent. To the right there is Boubacar Bari, who's retired, but still writing. He came to North America to accept an honor as the honorary foreign visitor at the American Historical Association. The two books below there are his most famous books. But the other thing is that he's been at it since 1971, when he finished up his doctoral work and then became the first, he was a key person both in the Association of African Historians and in CODESRIA. So for that many years, this man has been active in Africa, so he's one of those folks who stayed on the continent in African life, traveling elsewhere, of course. And then I put University of Ibadan down there at the bottom. We started off with University of Ibadan, so it remains a big, strong university. What's different is that nowadays Nigeria has more than 100 universities. These are not all world-class universities. You know, a lot of them are small confessional schools and so forth. But on the other hand, that's the universities. Those are the ones that have the title of universities. So all the other ones that are college. Okay, so that tells you in Nigeria, and not only in Nigeria, that formal education, post-secondary education, is a high priority on the African continent. And there's graduation day at the University of Dar es Salaam. I found this neat book published in 2007 called Dude, Where's My Black Studies Department? And, you know, I just was arguing a moment ago that Black Studies departments got a kickstart, a startup again in the 1990s. But there's always room for complaint. There's always room for optimism about how the programs are moving ahead. It's really difficult to know how to strike the balance. I couldn't resist putting Black Panther there for you to take a look at, but that's because there's a level of popular presentation of and acceptance of a vision of Africa that was worked out together by people from Africa and from North America, as opposed to the old ways that Hollywood used to deal with people of African descent. And finally, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It opened in 2016. There's the opening day ceremony. How many of you have been there to the museum? Yeah. So find a way to get to Washington, to the mall, to all the things that Smithsonian has. But this museum has been really extraordinarily successful for everyone who visits it. And then I squeezed in a look at my own African diaspora book, which came out in 2009, but I also put the recent translation into French there, because I was pleased to see it get across that boundary. And interestingly, it was published by Présence Africaine, which is still at work. So that's my talk. I'll finish up with this set of questions. So if we're talking about Africana Studies, or could be Afrocentric perspective, like one question that comes up is there a standard perspective? Does everybody in these fields have the same way of looking at things? And and what I realized is the answer is yes, at this level, at the level that if you're working on the history and culture of people of Africa or the African diaspora, you always have to spend a certain amount of time defending yourself against the neglect and rejection, dismissal, or simple old stereotypes that are left over, that don't carry on, that all of us carry around to some degree. So that's one part of it. And then the second part of it is for resources. Resources are always in short supply. I mean, this Africana Studies is not the only field for which resources are in short supply. But it's, thinking of scholars in Africa at the 100 Nigerian universities, if you want to think about it that way, how well are they equipped electronically and so forth. It's tough. And on the other hand, because we're dealing with so many people in so many different situations, with so many languages and religions and experiences and so forth, the analysis, the schooling, the scholarship is always going to have lots of perspectives, lots of arguments. And so that's the balance to this. Basically, back to the first question, point is the yes there is a serious focus on studying the details of what is within the realm of Africana Studies. And then once you study the details, we all go off in different directions. So, and then my final point is just my own personal statement from having reviewed the literature by African scholars in the last 50, 60 years and so forth again, is to see how extraordinarily the scholarship is expanding over that whole time, and then especially in the last 20, 30 years. So we have a lot to read. All right, thank you very much.
So we have a question.
Hi.
I'm still conflicted with the term Black Studies. Can you just explain what it entails? Because I think your first slide, when you said the Black Studies program started up around the 1945, I was thinking is it kind of touching on African diaspora? Is it just currently, the lives of Black individuals? What does Black Studies entail?
So you can't have Black Studies until you have Black adopted by people as a term of defining themselves. Okay, so that's 1968. It's not before that. So I just remember really clearly watching people I knew go through that change of identity at varying paces. And then I know some people who still have not made the step, okay? So there's a chronology. And then Black Studies, the term came especially out of domestic American studies. So Black Studies initially meant African American studies. It meant African American history. And that was, and the term African American was created and adopted almost immediately after the term Black for people. So there's one of the complicated things about history of people of African descent is living in this larger world, and the names that people give themselves and the names they're given by a dominant white society are changing again and again. And then who's controlling the changes is really interesting. And so your question is the right one to pose. There's no way I'm going to come up with a nice, simple answer for it. Okay, but I can give you some chronological things, all right? So I've started with that. So Black Studies starts at a certain point with a very domestic sort of thing. African American, that in that case, people are adding Africa to their identity. So I mean, that identity, that statement, that label clearly came out of the Black community or the African American community. And then Africana term shows up rather later. To what degree would the term Africana used before the 90s, Magan? What do you think?
So, you know, it first encountered somewhere with Du Bois.
Yes, okay.
So, you know, it's early, but it's not something that's doesn't gain credence until the close of the 20th century.
But to me, it conveys a comfortable sense of interconnection between continent and diaspora.
Well, Africa and diaspora. And then so back to Opie's question, before we even get to Black Studies, and so you're looking at Du Bois, you're looking at Carter G. Woodson.
Yeah.
The initial thrust of thinking about what was studied was the Negro.
Negro history, yeah.
So Du Bois talked about pan-Negro,
Right.
so people of Negro descent worldwide, okay? But the documentation, the institutional fabric were things like the Association for the Study of Negro Life and Culture, which then becomes the Association for the Study of African American Life and Culture. But that's a progression.
Yes.
So people are, the question of identity, and this is one of the things we deal with, the question of identity is constantly being reformulated and refined, and in its reformulation and refinement, it, in many instances, seeks to have a broader, encapsulate a broader group of people in terms of diaspora.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so this story is complicated and so forth, but it's not the only community that goes through redefining itself. So with what you know from having, you know, once you get good at this story, you can look at any other community and see the times and the historical situations in which the identities change.
And then, if I may also
Please.
add to that, I think part of also what we are referring to is Black Studies. I think it's, and what Professor Mani is calling attention to is the moment when it became a category of academic, you know, engagement, you know, for knowledge production, for knowledge, you know, distribution and the like. So until at least until late 60s, you didn't have that kind of formal, you know, institutionalization of Black Studies as it were.
Right.
And so that marked, so the date he's giving us marked that kind of formal integration of, or at least the introduction, if not integration of that into regular or
No, but I think that's really an important issue because we hear a lot about multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity nowadays. But in the 1960s, there was area studies programs. So as you know, America in its imperial position organizes study of Russia and Eastern Europe, Asia,
Right.
Latin America, Africa, and in multidisciplinary programs. So I was educated in a program in African history, but it was also African studies with different disciplines. Black Studies was the only place in study of America where you would take that multidisciplinary approach. So the African American Studies department that I was in, we had musicians, we had people in theater, we had people in political science, we had people in anthropology, in history, and we worked together. And so my life was to move from the history department, which was nice, it was all historians, but to the excitement of interdisciplinary connection there. And our African American Studies department went to the dean and said, we would like you to give us support as a leading department to show other departments how to carry ahead with interdisciplinarity, because they were talking about that at the university. And the dean, who was a physicist, he just couldn't imagine that. But in fact, it's working out that way. So it's, okay, so,
So it goes back to part of what we discussed in class in terms of, you think about Du Bois in the beginning of trying to formalize this kind of thing, and the idea that Rebecca gives you is saying, well, the guy is interdisciplinarian, all right? But it focuses on the question of people of African descent within the context of the United States. So it's the first time that this is happening in a domestic intellectual project
Yeah.
in the United States. The other point that needs to be made, though, is that it's also, Black studies in its formalization is also a political statement. The political statement, when it becomes globalized, has different meanings. So the political statement in the domestic United States, to designate that we're going to have something like Black studies, and to say University of San Francisco, or wherever we're going to start, we're having Black studies, that is an aggressive act of agency.
Right.
Saying, no, we're not going to be this, we're going to be this, and this is how you're going to address us and what we do. When it's translated in other spaces, let's say 1990s Great Britain, Thatcher Great Britain, okay? Then the idea of to be black in Britain is a political statement similar to what's being said in the United States, okay? But the blackness is constructed around political constituencies that see themselves as outside of the status quo in Britain. So if you're black in Britain, you're not only of African descent or from the Caribbean, but you are also Pakistani, you're Indian, you're Asian, you're whatever is being discriminated upon in British space.
Right.
And they all come in and say, we're black. And so if you're from North America and you walk into that space, all right, and you're meeting those people and they say, we're black, it's like, what does that mean? How do I understand this? And so that's part of the discussion that's going on in terms of the refinement of whatever the study is. Africana I prefer because it globalizes this experience, but you still have to look at the way in which people are taking terminology and reinterpreting it. Anything else? Anyone else? So, Pat, I just have to say that you took me back because lots of my friends were up there on the screen, okay? People I studied with, people I worked with, so yes, it's been
pretty interesting group of
Pretty
people, don't you think? It's a creation of a new, not necessarily, a new disciplinary framework in that it's formally multidisciplinary across social sciences and humanities, right? So even though you and I are historians, we have to keep up with what's going on in literature.
Yep, yes. It's a discussion.
That succeeded with, I don't want to emphasize the underfunding too much, but it's never been, even in Harvard, they don't have too much funding.
Yeah.
But in terms of it, and I'll make the comparison with Middle East studies in the same time period. So when I started studying, I did history of Africa and history of the Middle East, was the way it was labeled then. And the Middle East literature was very potent. They were established from a bunch of Orientalist scholarship that had gone for a long time, and the Africanists were just beginning. In the 60 years since then, largely, I think, because of the unending political strife in the Middle East. The academic work on the region, it's not that it hasn't gone ahead, it has too, but it's that studies on Africa and through Africa looking at the whole of the diaspora. There I'm using that term rather than to say the whole full range of Africana studies. There's a flexibility of breadth, but also just a depth in the analysis that comes as a result of hard work within a well-organized framework.
So, Professor Mania, what are your thoughts on some Black Studies programs that focus on, say, African American, life and history, and that is essentially about Africans in the diaspora here in the United States, without much interest or keenness toward exploring blackness in its diaspora, as it were.
Yeah, I grumble and have grumbled, but there's room for lots of historians, for lots of scholars. I mean, the detailed work that's being done, just the amount of time that it took to go and straighten out Sally Hemings' family history, right? That required a very narrow, not just a narrow perspective. It included, key events took place in Paris and so forth. Okay, so there's reason for work at that field, as long as the work at that field doesn't reject things from other places, because there used to be, amongst people in doing African American history, there used to be a fear of connecting to Africa. That stuff's gone nowadays. So I'm looking at our University of Pittsburgh has just hired an African American historian who is a Native American historian. Well, in fact, in her personal life as well as in her scholarship, there's a little of each. And so, working within the country, we're working across borders. So it's complicated for us to keep track of working at multiple scales. So this is, to me, an important, really general issue in any place in scientific studies, is that we nowadays in each field have to be able to work at multiple scales. In biology, it's from the cell or the subcell up to whole herds and so forth, and in history to work at levels from the family level to the planetary level, but to understand that those are part of the same framework. Disciplines are set up to divide people into separate camps so you don't look across those borders, and interdisciplinarity is reaching across those. Okay, and so the way ahead for Africana Studies was to cross the borders, and that was good for Africana Studies, but it's also, shining the light ahead for a bunch of other fields as well. But see, now if I take that approach, I'm offering no judgments on other people. So I'm going to get in a given situation, and I'm going to say this particular field topic ought to be defined more narrowly or more broadly for a different purpose. But that question of scale is now required to be part of what we discuss. Thank you so much for the chance to come and talk and listen and to experience.